so I wanted to address like in all the craziness from the whole Odinite angle and the whole argument for the Frank's hearing, Frank's motion. I think it's a motion. I don't know. But is to basically say that Tony Liggett falsified information to Judge Diener in order to obtain the search warrant. And so this part is, in my opinion, the most important thing to discuss. I'm actually gonna kick it over to this lawyer to kind of summarize what it says, and then I'm gonna have my screen reader read it, and I'll pause a little bit to comment. And so here we go.
Part 3 is really the heart of the Franks hearing issue. This section goes into detail about the false, misleading, and omitted facts that led to the search warrant being signed. The defense says the warrant would never have been signed by a judge if the search warrant submitted to the judge did not conceal information and did not supply false information. This section relies heavily on sealed exhibits, but the gist of it is the witness who allegedly saw Richard Allen on the bridge described him as slender and youthful, boyish looking, in his 20s or early 30s, having poofy hair, and having no facial hair. This is not an accurate description of Richard Allen. This information was not put into the search warrant affidavit submitted to the judge. Additionally, this same witness no longer sees Richard Allen's car parked at the CPS lot at 2:15 p.m. This creates timeline issues for the state. This information was left out of the search warrant affidavit as well. Another witness was reported by law enforcement to have seen a man wearing a blue jacket with muddy and bloody clothing walking on 300 North. It turns out that is not correct because that same witness in 2017 told investigators the man was wearing a tan or light colored jacket, not a blue jacket, and nowhere in this 2017 statement does the witness actually say bloody, just muddy. These allegations in Part 3 do seem to be extremely problematic for the state. Conflicting identification, bad timeline, wrong colored jacket, and the absence of the bloody description. That is some seriously messy investigative work. But will it be enough to get the warrant set aside? Well, only time will tell. Part 4 jumps back into the Odinism angle of this case and shows how the guards who are watching over Richard Allen are connected to.
And then, like, for anyone who thinks that the defense is being, like, petty in this document, which at parts, the tone to it is, like, a little bit, I guess you could say petty, but it's, like, if you think about it, they're defending someone who they're saying is innocent. And they're going through all this information and just seeing these, like, incompetencies and also, like, lies that led to this guy who they say is innocent being in solitary confinement in, like, the worst conditions for, like, we're going on a year now. I just want you guys to think, like, just suspend, like, all previous notions that Richard Allen is guilty, seeing as this is actually, like, the first time we're actually hearing his side of things. But just consider for a second that he is innocent, and, like, how crazy would it be that you end up in solitary confinement for, like, a year for being, like, cooperative with the investigation. Literally know nothing about him, because in this you learn that he was actually a part of the National Guard at some point, and none of us knew that about him, which is a little bit crazy to me that nobody figured that part out. So we're not that good a sleuths, I guess. Just, like, everybody's vision of him could be just so completely wrong. He could just be, like, a family guy who works at a pharmacy and has a wife and kid who he seems like he spent all his time with his wife and, like, going to work and hiking. And I don't know if he did it or not. Maybe he did, and he's just, like, a crazy, like, we just really don't know anything about him, which I already said. Like, obviously we're not that good as sleuths, but it's crazy to, like, think that this guy, potentially innocent, has been going through this, and, like, literally nobody in his town cares. Like, everybody just condemned him so quick. Like, yeah. Anyways, let's get into this.
3. Liggett concealed and falsified evidence in his affidavit for search warrant. The concealed and falsified evidence blows Liggett's timeline apart, which explains why he concealed and falsified information. For Liggett's timeline to work and to place Richard Allen on the Monon High Bridge at 2:13, the time of the famous down the hill video, Liggett desperately needed Betsy Blair to describe a man on the Monon High Bridge that looked like Richard Allen, and perhaps more importantly needed Betsy Blair to describe a car that she observed parked at the CPS parking lot at approximately 2:15 p.m. as looked like Richard Allen's black Ford Focus. Betsy Blair's description of the man she observed on the Monon High Bridge around 2 p.m. looked nothing like Richard Allen. Liggett concealed this information from Judge Diener. Betsy Blair's description of the vehicle she observed at the CPS parking lot looked nothing like a black Ford Focus. Liggett also concealed this information from Judge Diener. For good measure, Liggett also lied about what Sarah Carbaugh observed at 3:57 p.m. that also blew up his timeline. Betsy Blair's first description of the man she saw on the bridge was memorialized in sketch number 2, illustrated on February 17, 2017, 3 days after the girls were found, but not released to the public until April 22, 2019, following Superintendent Doug Carter's press conference.
During the course of this investigation, we have concluded the first sketch released will become secondary as of today. The result of the new information and intelligence over time leads us to believe the sketch, which you will see shortly, is the person responsible for the murders of these two little girls.
On February 17, 2017, Betsy Blair met with State Police sketch artist Taylor D. Bryant and provided a description of the man she observed from 50 feet away on the Monon High Bridge, the same man that Liggett claimed in his affidavit was the killer. Betsy Blair told the sketch artist that the man Betsy Blair observed was a white male age 20. Had brown curly hair. 105. Medium build. Find attached and marked as Exhibit 103 the unredacted, facial identification reference sheet, filed as confidential, that contains the description that Betsy Blair provided to the sketch artist. Also, find attached a copy of the sketch that Taylor D. Bryant produced from Betsy Blair's description of the man she observed on the bridge, marked as Exhibit 104. This illustration is also called sketch #2 inches because it was released to the public second. Upon looking at the sketch, Betsy Blair told the sketch artist that the illustration was a 10 out of 10 inches for accuracy. 144. The Unified Command did not release the Betsy Blair sketch to the public for over 2 years. Instead, they first released the Sarah Carbaugh sketch, also called sketch #1 inch because it was released to the public first. The Sarah Carbaugh sketch was illustrated by FBI sketch artist, Plants, from Detroit on June 19, 2017, and released to the public on July 17, 2017. 145. Who was the person that Sarah Carbaugh was describing in her sketch? According to Liggett's affidavit, at approximately 3:57 p.m., Sarah Carbaugh observed a man walking westbound on County Road 300 North. Sarah Carbaugh was headed eastbound on County Road 300N, operating her motor vehicle while simultaneously observing this man walking on the road toward her on the opposite side of the road. This is the same man that Sarah Carbaugh described for the sketch artist on June 19, 2017. We will be discussing Sarah Carbaugh's description of that man later. Roughly 2 years later, in March 2019, Betsy Blair met with Tony Liggett, frustrated that her sketch #2, had not been released to the public. 146. Betsy was frustrated because sketch #1, which had been released to the public almost 2 years before, did not match the man that she 7. Betsy Blair observed on the High Bridge. Betsy even commented that sketch #1 was wrong. 147. Certainly, it was odd that the Sarah Carbaugh sketch was chosen to be released over the Betsy Blair sketch, for the following reasons. Betsy Blair provided her description to the sketch artist only 4 days after seeing the man on the bridge while it was fresh on her mind, compared with Sarah Carbaugh, who provided her description to the sketch artist 126 days after Carbaugh observed the man on the road. Betsy Blair had a good look at the man's face, while stationary, from only 50 feet away. 148. Sarah Carbaugh was not stationary, but rather traveling down the road operating her vehicle while simultaneously trying to observe the man on the road. 149. During her March 7, 2017, interview, Betsy Blair was talking with 2 members of Unified Command, Kevin Hammond and Tony Liggett. At this interview, Betsy Blair told Liggett, facetto face, that the man Betsy Blair observed on the High Bridge fit the following description. The man was slender and youthful looking. He was more boyish looking. The man was in his 20s to early 30s. His hair seemed puffy, just as the sketch portrayed. He had no facial hair, that she can remember. 150. Finally, on April 22, 2019, Unified Command released Betsy Blair's sketch #2 to the general public. In fact, upon its release, Superintendent Doug Carter commented that the man in sketch #2 was responsible for the murders. 151. Also, at the time of the release of sketch #2, Doug Carter also stated that sketch #1 had now become secondary to the investigation. 152. On March 7, 2019, Liggett was present when Betsy Blair described the man she observed on the bridge. Betsy was actually talking to Liggett face to face when she provided the description. 153. Liggett heard Betsy's description of a much younger man with brown puffy hair but chose to conceal this information from Judge Diener. Blair's description of a youthful, boyish-looking person in his 20s, maybe early 30s with brown puffy hair, obviously, does not at all describe Richard Allen. 154. In order for Liggett to have provided Judge Diener with honest and accurate information, he would have had to state the following in his affidavit. I, Tony Liggett, believe that Richard Allen is the man that murdered the girls for reasons stated herein. I also believe that the man that Betsy Blair observed on the bridge is Richard Allen, and therefore the killer. However, I must also inform the court that the man that Betsy Blair observed on the bridge really looks nothing like Richard Allen. Whereas Richard Allen was a man in his mid-40s with short or even shaved grayish hair. 155 The man that Betsy Blair described was youthful, boyish-looking, and had brown, puffy, hair. Also, Your Honor, Betsy Blair told the sketch artist that the man she saw on the bridge was just 20 years old. This description came only 4 days after she observed the man on the bridge. 2 years later, Betsy Blair still maintains that the man was in his 20s or maybe early 30s. Also, Betsy Blair told the sketch artist back in 2017 that the resemblance of the boyish sketch to the man that she observed on the bridge was a 10 out of 10. I must also tell you, Judge, that this 10 out of 10 sketch looks absolutely nothing like Richard Allen. Liggett had a legal obligation to inform Judge Diener of the vast differences between Betsy Blair's description of the man she observed on the bridge and Richard Allen. He did not. That fact alone should be sufficient to merit tossing the warrant and suppressing the fruits of an illegal search. However, there is more. In order for Liggett's timeline to work, he needs Richard Allen's black Ford Focus to be parked at the CPS lot from 1:30 p.m. until 4:30 p.m. Betsy Blair sees one car at the CPS lot at 2:15 p.m. and it is not Richard Allen's car. Richard Allen voluntarily was interviewed on October 13, 2022. Watching the videotaped interview, it is apparent that Richard thought he was being asked questions to help assist the police in solving the crime. 156 In trying to provide Liggett and Mullen a timeline of when Richard Allen was at the trail, Richard stated he arrived at the trail around noon. 157 Later in the interview, Richard Allen told Liggett and Mullen that he probably left the trail around 1:30 p.m. 158 In his affidavit, Liggett states that Richard Allen parked his black Ford Focus at the CPS parking lot and then cut over to the trail, where Richard Allen then walked to the high bridge, ultimately following Abby and Libby across the bridge before abducting them. 159 After murdering the girls, Liggett stated in his affidavit that Betsy Carbaugh observed a man, that Liggett claims is Richard Allen, walking along 300 N at approximately 3:57 p.m. westbound toward the CPS parking lot. The implication being that Richard Allen was walking back to his car after abducting and murdering the girls. 160 Liggett's affidavit. If what Liggett wrote in his affidavit were true, then Richard Allen's black Ford Focus would have been parked in the CPS lot from 1:30 p.m. until at least 4 p.m., giving him time to abduct the girls, murder the girls and walk back to his black Ford Focus parked at the CPS parking lot sometime after 3:57 p.m. when Sarah Carbaugh observed Richard walking down 300 North. In other words, for Liggett's timeline to work, Richard Allen's black Ford Focus would have had to remain parked at the old CPS building from roughly 1:30 p.m. when Liggett claims Richard Allen arrived until roughly 4 p.m. after, as Liggett claims, Richard Allen had abducted and murdered the girls. If Richard's black Ford Focus was not on that CPS parking lot between those hours, 1:30 p.m. and 4 p.m., then Liggett's timeline would be blown. In his deposition, Liggett was asked a series of questions by defense counsel and Liggett answered those questions.
Okay, I'm going to pause right here really quick because I have like a few comments. One, like, Richard Allen went in there willingly to talk to them and he was trying to help. And so let this be a reminder to us all that if you're talking to the police, you should have a lawyer present or you should remain silent because their intentions can and will be held against you in the court of law. So that's just a side note. And for people that are like, oh, if he's innocent, why does he want like all this information thrown out? You guys obviously have never dealt with like the whole legal system and you're naively thinking that police are there to help you and find out the truth, which that should be their intention, and I think most of the time it is. However, as we've seen throughout like the release of the Ron Logan warrant, Keegan Kline, Richard Allen, and now this new information about like the Odinites or whatever, all of those people have compelling evidence. Like if you only hear what they're presenting against those people, you're like, yeah, they definitely did it. It was definitely them. But they can't have all done it. So like, let that be a reminder to us all that you should exercise your rights to remain silent. And absolutely, Richard Allen should be trying to get everything thrown out because that's how our legal system actually works. So, just wanted to throw that out there. Like, how messed up is it that like all the information seems like it's all misrepresented in order to obtain this search warrant? That's like, that's crazy to me. And also like the prosecution or like the investigative people, they should have realized that their whole 2 sketches with like no explanation and like not knowing whether it's the same person or 2 different people, like that was confusing to the public and it will be confusing to the jurors. Should have gotten that all together when they presented it to the public in the first place. And I also wonder how many other sketches are out there. Like, did the 3 girls make a sketch of who they saw? Did somebody's dad make a sketch of who flannel shirt guy was. Like, how many sketches are unreleased to the public? That's something I would really be interested in finding out. And then let's get back into this.
In his deposition, Liggett was asked a series of questions by defense counsel and Liggett answered those questions as follows. Q. Is it your contention that Richard Allen's black Ford Focus was parked at the old CPS building at 1:29 roughly p.m. on February 13, 2017? Yes. Q. Is it your contention that Richard Allen's black Ford Focus was parked at the old CPS building at 1:45 p.m. on February 13th? Yes. Q. Is it your contention CPS building at 2 p.m. Is it your contention that Richard Allen's black Ford Focus was parked at the old CPS building at 4 p.m. on February 13th? Yes. Q. Is it your contention that Richard Allen's black Ford Focus was parked at the old CPS building at 4:30 p.m. on February 13th? Number. Q. What time do you contend that Richard Allen's black Ford Focus was no longer parked at the old CPS building? Around 4 o'clock. Through his answers, Liggett demonstrated that he recognized that for his timeline to work, Richard Allen's black Ford Focus would have to be parked at the CPS lot from 1:30 p.m. to 4 p.m. in order to give Richard the time to abduct and murder the girls and return to his vehicle. Therefore, if there was any evidence that Richard Allen's black Ford Focus was not parked in the old CPS parking lot between those times, that is something that he, Liggett, would be required to 111 share with Judge Diener. Rather than tell the truth, Liggett concealed the evidence that Richard's black Ford Focus had left the CPS parking lot probably at 1:30 p.m., but certainly before 2:15 p.m. when Blair saw a completely different car, and therefore, Richard Allen could not have been on the bridge at 2 p.m. or committed the murders soon thereafter. For starters, as noted earlier, in his interview with Liggett and Mullen, Richard Allen stated that he, Richard Allen, arrived at the trails around noon and left around 1:30 p.m. Liggett failed to inform Judge Diener that Richard Allen stated he had left the trails at 1:30. He should have, especially if there were evidence that a different vehicle was parked at the old CPS lot after 1:30 p.m. but before 4 p.m., which would then support Richard Allen's statement that he, Richard Allen, left the CPS building around 1:30 p.m. So, the next question to ask is, did anyone see a vehicle parked at the old CPS building between 1:30 p.m. and 4 p.m. that did not resemble Richard Allen's black Ford Focus, thus supporting the timeline that Richard Allen provided to Liggett, but which Liggett concealed from Judge Diener? The answer is yes, Betsy Blair.
Okay, I just wanted to cut in here again because there was also some guy who called into Gray Hughes and was talking about the vehicle that he had seen parked in the Mears parking lot. And I don't really remember like the details of that, but if anybody does, like comment below if anyone knows what I'm talking about. Okay, thank you.
When Betsy Blair arrived at the trail at roughly 1:46 p.m., Betsy Blair had parked her vehicle in a different location that the defense calls the Mears parking lot. When she left the Monon Trail and pulled out of the Mears parking lot, Betsy Blair headed west on 300 North in her car and was spotted on the Hoosier Harvest store camera heading toward the old CPS lot at 2:14 p.m. The old CPS lot is only a 36-second drive from the Hoosier Harvest store camera. 161 giving Betsy Blair a full minute to drive from the Hoosier Harvest store to the old CPS lot would mean that Betsy Blair would pass the old CPS lot at around 2:15 p.m. Remember, that Liggett has admitted to under oath that at 2:15 p.m., Richard Allen's black Ford Focus would be parked at the CPS building while he, Richard Allen, was abducting and murdering the girls. However, at 2:15 p.m. when Betsy Blair passed the old CPS building, Betsy Blair did not see a black Ford Focus parked at the old CPS lot. The car that Betsy Blair observed as she passed the old CPS building at 2:15 p.m. looked nothing like a black Ford Focus. According to Liggett's own report, Betsy Blair observed one car parked in the CPS lot at 2:15, and that car resembled a 1965 Ford Comet 162 that her father once owned. 163 The shape had sharper angles. 164 Again, to whom did Betsy Blair provide this description of a 1965 Ford Comet-looking, angular in appearance vehicle? None other than Liggett himself. 165 Liggett was fully aware that the car that Betsy Blair described as being backed into a spot at the old CPS building looked nothing like Richard Allen's black Ford Focus, but Liggett concealed that information from Judge Diener. It should also be noted that if Richard Allen left at 1:30 p.m., then the person that Betsy Blair observed on the high bridge at roughly 2 p.m. was not Richard Allen. This would explain why the person that Betsy Blair observed on the high bridge looked nothing like Richard Allen, because it wasn't Richard Allen. It was a 20-year-old kid with brown puffy hair. Concealing Betsy Blair's description of the vehicle at the old CPS building from Judge Diener may have temporarily plugged a hole in the dam of Liggett's problematic timeline when Diener reviewed the affidavit on October 13, 2022, but Liggett's concealment has now been exposed. 113. And it gets even worse. When asked to describe the color of the car that resembles a 1965 Ford Comet, Betsy Blair actually told Liggett that the car she saw was not black. 166 That is right, Liggett heard from the mouth of Betsy Blair that the 1965 Ford Comet-looking vehicle was not even black, which is the color that Liggett needed the vehicle to be in order to fit the description of Richard's black Ford Focus as described in Liggett's affidavit. Because of Betsy's description of the car she viewed at the old CPS building, evidence supports that Richard Allen left at 1:30 p.m., as he told Liggett at some point in time after Richard left the old CPS lot. An older, angular-looking car that resembled a 1965 Comet and was not black arrived at the old CPS building. Then, the driver of this 1965 Ford Comet-looking, angular, non-black vehicle backed into the CPS parking lot. At roughly 2:15 p.m. when returning home, Betsy Blair observed this car that reminded her of a car her dad had growing up. All of this adds up to this fact. Evidence concealed by Liggett supports that Richard Allen was not at the crime scene, as he had already left at 1:30 p.m. and was already home by the time that Betsy Blair observed the 1965 Ford Comet-looking, non-black vehicle at the CPS parking lot. And Liggett knew it. Again, because of Betsy Blair's description of the vehicle she observed at the old CPS building, evidence supports that Richard Allen was also home by the time that Betsy Blair saw the 20-year-old with brown puffy hair on the bridge. Which, again, explains why the person on the bridge looks nothing like Richard Allen, because it wasn't Richard Allen. This is simply outrageous and abusive behavior on the part of Liggett. Abusive in that Liggett used his power as a law enforcement officer to conceal evidence to secure a search warrant. 26 days before an election in which he was running for sheriff. And at the brunt end of Liggett's abusive behavior is Richard Allen, who has been sitting and suffering in hell for over 10 months. Liggett doesn't even have the excuse that Betsy Blair provided the description to a different detective and therefore, Liggett could not have known of Blair's distinguishing description, making it a simple administrative snafu that fell through the cracks. No, Liggett heard the description straight from the mouth of Betsy Blair yet chose to conceal this timeline-destroying evidence from Judge Diener. If Judge Diener had known that evidence showed that Richard Allen was home by the time that the girls were abducted at 2:13 p.m., Diener would never have signed the search warrant. But that's not all. It gets even worse. Liggett flat out lied when he told Judge Diener that in 2017 Sarah Carbaugh described a man as wearing muddy and bloody clothing and was also wearing a blue jacket. For Liggett's timeline to work, not only did Liggett need for Richard Allen's black Ford Focus to be parked at the old CPS lot between 1:30 p.m. and 4 p.m., but he also needed Sarah Carbaugh's statement concerning the man she claims she saw walking westbound on 300 North at 3:57 to match Betsy Blair's description of a man wearing a blue jacket. It would also help if the man had blood on his clothing to further tie him into the murder. In his affidavit, Liggett wrote the following. An interview was done of Sarah Carbaugh in 2017. She states that she was traveling east on 300 North and observed a male subject walking west, on the north side of 300 North, away less than 6 greater than Monon High Bridge. She stated that he was wearing a blue-colored jacket and blue jeans and was muddy and bloody. She further stated that it appeared that he had gotten in a fight. Investigators determined from the video that she was on 300 North at 15:57 hours. The blue jacket described by Sarah Carbaugh would need to match the color of the jacket described by Betsy Blair to help with Liggett's timeline. Again, the blood on the clothing would 115. Be an added bonus in that it would tie the man that Sarah Carbaugh observed in with the murders and therefore assist Judge Diener in making the decision to sign the warrant. The problem is that in 2017, Sarah Carbaugh told Liggett to his face that the man she observed walking west on 300 North was wearing a tan-colored coat, a lighter-colored coat, not a blue jacket. 167. This is a problem because the color of this man's coat did not match the coat of the 20-year-old boyish-looking man with the puffy brown hair that Betsy Blair observed on the High Bridge around 2 p.m. According to Liggett, both of these men were Richard Allen. 168. Another way to put that is that Liggett has asserted that sketch number 1 and sketch number 2 are the exact same man, Richard Allen. 169. Carbaugh saw a man walking on 300 North wearing a jacket. Liggett needed the color of that jacket to match the color of the jacket worn by the man Betsy Blair had observed on the High Bridge at 2 p.m. because Liggett is claiming that both men are the same man, Richard Allen. The problem was that Carbaugh did not observe the man walking down 300 North wearing a blue jacket. She observed a tan jacket. This meant that Sarah Carbaugh and Betsy Blair observed two different men. This created a problem for Liggett's timeline, so instead of being honest, Liggett chose to represent to Judge Diener that Carbaugh observed a man wearing a blue jacket when in her 2017 interview, Carbaugh said it was tan. But that's not all. Nowhere in Sarah Carbaugh's 2017 interview does Sarah Carbaugh use the word bloody to describe nowhere. The so-called muddy bloody lady is actually just the muddy lady, as Carbaugh only used the word muddy to describe the man she observed on 300 North in her 2017 interview. It certainly would help Judge Diener in making his decision if the man walking down the street was wearing a blue jacket and also wearing bloody clothing, as if he had just murdered somebody. However, Liggett just flat out lied. Sarah Carbaugh never mentioned a blue coat and never mentioned blood in her 2017 interview. Instead of lying, had Liggett told Judge Diener that the man walking down 300 North at 3:57 p.m. was wearing a light-colored tan coat, instead of a blue coat, then Judge Diener would have realized that Betsy Blair and Sarah Carbaugh did not see the same man. Instead of lying, had Liggett told Judge Diener that the man walking down 300 North only had on muddy clothing, then Judge Diener would not have associated the man with murder. Again, Liggett can't claim that when drafting the affidavit, Liggett relied on the false description provided by a different investigator. No, Sarah Carbaugh told Liggett to his face that the man she observed was wearing a tan coat and was only muddy, not bloody. If Judge Diener had been told the truth, he would not have, nor should he have, signed the search warrant. Conclusion of Part 3. There is a reason that in his sworn affidavit Liggett concealed key information from Judge Diener and lied about other key information. Had Diener known the hidden and falsified facts, then Diener would never have signed the search warrant, a search warrant that was already insufficient in linking Richard Allen to the murders even before Liggett's lies and deceptions. It was a completely different man that had mud, not blood, on his clothing. Betsy Blair saw one man, perhaps the same man that Rayleigh Voorhees, Bree Wilbur and Anna Spatz saw on the trail. Sarah Carbaugh observed a completely different man. And while all these witnesses were observing two different men, Richard Allen was at home where he had been since leaving the Monon Trail on or before 1:30 p.m. That is the difference the concealed and falsified evidence would have made for Judge Diener.
Okay, so one question I just freaking came up for me right now is Rayleigh Voorhees is of no relation to Alex Voorhees, or are they connected in some ways? That just seems like a like not a very common last name. So that's an interesting little tidbit, which I actually have thought about before, but that just reminded me of it right now. So, I mean, they make a pretty compelling argument. However, we don't know how many times they interviewed these witnesses and whether their statements changed. Um, but I think they have a good point with the sketches. Like, if Tony Liggett claims that the girl who made the first sketch and the girl who made the second sketch um, both saw the murderer, then they therefore have to be the same person. And I would really like to hear the confession. I'm like very happy to hear that there apparently is video of all the interviews. Like that's takes a lot of like, oh, good thing that happened, you know? Because um, while I'm hard on investigators, I feel like that right there shows that they're at least attempting to do things in a good way, because videotaping the interviews is like a crucial thing to know, like how those interviews were conducted, if they were like abusive in any way to like coerce confessions. That's like very excellent that they're recorded. That like puts my mind at ease a little bit. Um, and also I just want to say that like the defense team, they're good writers. Like while there's so much information and everything throughout this whole filing, it's really like complex, but they explain everything well. And it does make you just want to keep reading through because they do a good job of like kind of like telling a story. And um while we don't know it's true or whatever, and like I would like to hear their like response to this, because as far as we know they could explain everything away. It does give some reasonable doubt, in my opinion, at this point of what we have from the information thus far. So, oh yeah, one more thing I wanted to add. I'm gonna look up that car that they say, and so I can show you guys that too. Okay. Thank you guys for watching. Please like, share, subscribe, and have a nice day. Bye.